The biggest thing that stayed with me from the book, 23 Things That I Don't Tell You About Capitalism, is the explanation that you give for why there is actually no such thing as a free market.
Yes, that idea had developed over probably the couple of decades since I started my academic career. I mean, it was the first formulated in this article that I published in 2002 in this journal called Cambridge Journal of Economics. But yeah, I mean, that leading up to that point, you know, this was the late 80s, 90s, when I was at the first PhD student and then a junior academic. And at the time, the world was dominated by the most rigid kind of free market economics. And yeah, I mean, you kind of took it for granted that people knew what they were talking about, even if you don't agree with them. But when they were talking about the free market, but I realized actually what is the free market? Because you read the different gurus of free market economics, you know, Friedrich von Hayek, Milton Friedman, they are all slightly different. Yeah, I mean, their definition of free market is actually not the same. So I got to explore this, think about this, and also doing work on economic history as a sideline, I realized that the notion of what is a free market has changed enormously over time. You know, so in the 19th century, not all, but many Americans, the free market included the free market in people. You know, there were market for the slaves. Yeah. I mean, in the 19th century, Britain and other European countries, free market included labor market with labor. So I got to really think about this and basically come to realize that what is a free market depends on your ethics, your philosophy, and your idea on how the economy works. For the same market, one group of people might say this is a free market and others may say it's not. I take the case of child labor. You know, when in the early 19th century, the reformers in Europe were trying to push for regulation of child labor, a lot of the free market economies were outraged because they thought that this was undermining the very foundation of free market economy, namely the freedom of contract. Yeah? So their point was, look, these kids want to work, they need to work. These are the factory owners that want to employ them. What is your problem? It's not as if these factory owners kidnap these children and use them as slave labor. It's based on the free contract. Yeah? Now, if you take that view, you know, you'd of course say that trying to intervene in the labor market by regulating child labor is anti-free market policy. But on the other hand, these days, not even the most ardent supporters of free market do not say that, oh, we need to bring back child labor so that our labor market can be truly free, because in the last couple of centuries, even these people have come to accept that, yes, the right of children to have a childhood and education has a priority over freedom of contract. Yeah? Once you accept that, you don't even consider it as a regulation. But when you think about it, this is a huge regulation, because if you say, I mean, it's a hypothetical situation, but if you try to ban completely child labor in the very poor countries where 40-50% of the people are working, and I'm not talking about, you know, taking care of the family goat and, you know, getting fired, that kind of work. I mean, we are talking about the children actually doing adults' work. And in many poor countries that, you know, the 40-50% of the children might be working. And in that kind of situation, if you try to ban child labor, it would be tantamount to, I don't know, the U.S. government saying that everybody whose social security number ends with an odd number will be prevented from working from tomorrow. I mean, there'll be a riot. So it's that kind of huge regulation banning child labor. But these days, most people don't even see it as a regulation. No one says that we don't really have a free market economy because we ban child labor. We have banned slavery. So all these examples that make you realize that actually the idea of free market itself is a political construct. I would go even further and say that market itself is a political construct, because all markets have some political institutions at the foundation of it, which embody certain ethical values. This means that there is no kind of scientific, totally objective way of drawing the boundary around the free market. And once you begin to accept that, you begin to understand the economy in a very different way, because it means that the economy now needs the public deliberation, that we need to think about the ethical values, that we need to think about the political institutions before you decide what kind of economy we are going to have.
Maybe you could answer the question by giving an example of the US, like you do in the book. People might think that the US is as close as we've got to a sort of free market, capitalist sort of utopia, as close to the original philosophy as they'd come. But you realize that, wait a minute, as soon as the FDA is involved, that's regulation. That's not free market at play. As soon as you have immigration involved, that's a type of protectionism, regulation, no longer a free market. It's not just simply the equilibrium of demand and supply in every single domain. So could you explain, maybe using the USA as an example, why there is no such thing as a free market?
That's a good way of doing it. Yeah. Okay. So these days we are told to aspire to basically copy the U.S. model of capitalism, which comes as closest to the ideal free market economy as possible. And yeah, indeed, many Americans will say Britain's a socialist country because they have nationalized the health service. Sweden's a socialist country because they have very high income tax and so on. But even the U.S., let's look at it a bit more closely. So, probably if you go back to the 19th century, you didn't have all sorts of regulations on the food standard, drug safety, environmental regulation. Of course, these regulations were not there in the beginning. Maybe when you think about those things, the U.S. may be far more socialist than what it used to be. But by today's standard, it seems to have the smallest amount of regulation. Even then, the country has a welfare state that is much smaller than in, say, Sweden, but it still takes up 80-90% of GDP. You have all sorts of regulations on drugs and food safety and environment. Maybe lighter than in Sweden, lighter than in Japan, but still lots of regulations. And the U.S. has over time introduced a lot of regulations regarding labor issues. So slavery was banned after the Civil War, and then child labor was banned. And indeed, there are restrictions on the working hours and the work safety and all sorts of things, which when they were first beginning to be introduced, were vehemently opposed by the free market advocates. And let's not forget that the U.S. also has huge government influence on how the economy develops, because it may not have the kind of the very interventionist policies that you see in the countries like, Korea or Germany or Finland, but the U.S. government hugely influences the course of its economic development by funding a huge portion of the research and development. So it was even higher during the days of Cold War, because at the time the U.S. government put a lot of the research money into the developing electronics and aircraft and so on. So, my friend Mariana Mazzucato that became famous for writing this paper showing how just about every single piece of technology in the iPhone was initially funded by the U.S. government.
Yeah, which is the most incredible counter argument to just supply and demand in a totally unregulated market is going to sort everything out.
Yeah, and go back further in history, in the 19th century, the U.S. was the most protectionist economy in the world. It goes on. So yes, I'm not saying that this or that regulation is necessarily justified or that should be abolished or whatever, but you have to realize that you don't see these things and think the U.S. is a free market economy only because that you have so totally accepted the political, ethical, and economic premises under these regulations and interventions that you fail to see them.
And the book had made such an impression on me because I did an economics degree, right? And I went through the entire 3 years and had never heard of Friedrich Hayek, and I'd barely heard of Milton Friedman. And so when I discovered these guys, I thought, oh, wait, here is the answer. And I became, full free market, hardcore, to Austrian to the end. And the first real counter to that was reading your book, which just added so much more flavor to it. And Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. I think just the combination of those two books taught me significantly more about economics and, say, maybe developmental economics than any degree maybe could have. Obviously, it's removed from all of the microeconomics and the theoretical side of economics. But just from a practical example, it had a huge impression on me for that. And that chapter stood out to me probably most significantly. And I've been able to bring it up many times in conversations throughout the years, just like, wait a minute, you're telling me that you want an unregulated police force because you just think that the conditions of supply and demand are going to make it such. I'm like, wait a minute, it's too simple of an answer. And anyway, so to tack onto that, I'd love to hear, given your worldview, which country do you think has the best economic system?
Yeah, no, I'm very flattered to hear that my book provided you with a broader view by economics. But, my position is what they call pluralist. I believe that all these different schools of economics has some things to teach us. So, when people ask me, who are the, say, three most economists, who are the three economists who influence you the most, I would say Karl Marx on the left, Friedrich Hayek on the right, and Herbert Simon, the father of the behavioral economics, in the middle. And people freak out that they say, how can you be influenced both by Marx and Hayek? Hayek, I think, is the great economist. I mean, his view of the world is actually very much more sophisticated than the standard neoclassical view of the world represented by Milton Friedman. So even though they may advocate similar policies, I think Hayek was a much more profound thinker. So, I take all the different schools seriously. Basically, the point is that these different schools were developed to explain different things in different contexts. And they therefore made different assumptions about human nature and nature of the economy. That they also have different political and ethical positions. So one theory that might be perfect for one type of situation might be totally useless for another. One theory that is very good at explaining something might be totally incapable of explaining something else. So like that, my view on the ideal economic system is very pluralist in the sense that different countries faced different conditions, they wanted different things, and they all developed their different models. So the most shocking, striking example in that context is Singapore, because when you hear about Singapore in standard textbooks or the Wall Street Journal, the Economic Magazine, or whatever, you only hear about this free trade policy and its welcoming attitude towards the multinational corporations, which it has, but you are never told that 90% of land in Singapore is owned by the government. 85% of the housing is provided by the government housing corporation. A staggering 22% of GDP is produced by what are known as GLCs, government-linked corporations. These are corporations in which the government has, roughly at least 20% of the ownership, sometimes up to 100%. And I often challenge my graduate students, because if someone told you to design the best economic system according to a particular economic theory, no one could have invented something like Singapore, because it's a mixture of extreme socialism and extreme free market economics. So all systems are like that. I mean, Singapore is a very extreme example because it had a very peculiar condition of being a city-state, very limited land, a lot of internal political conflict initially. So they came up with these the ways of managing the economy. You had land and housing problems. So basically, without the government controlling it in some fashion, you couldn't have political stability, which was essential for economic development. Yeah? You had that relatively limited entrepreneurial resources, so you had to invite foreign firms to come and teach you things. But on the other hand, you didn't want to completely lose control of your economy to foreign companies. So you set up a lot of state-owned enterprises, in shipbuilding, in semiconductors, and even the famous Singapore Airlines. So all other countries have developed their systems in that kind of way. If you ask my preference, I think that Scandinavian countries and other Northern European countries have probably got that system that I like the most. But that doesn't mean that it's necessarily better or correct. Yeah? No, because they've been able to develop a system which combines the quite the egalitarian social arrangement and the dynamic, innovative economy. So I think they got the combinations right. I mean, the US might be innovative and dynamic, but it's too kind of well, I mean, how can I put it? Harsh for people who do not belong to, say, top 20%. Yeah? I mean, Bernie Sanders, some years ago in his presidential campaign, famously said that if you want an American dream, go to Scandinavia. Yeah? Because the US might have had very high social mobility up to, say, the 1950s and 60s, but the system has ossified, and now it has actually very low social mobility. Yeah? So actually, you have high social mobility in the countries like Sweden or Finland or the Netherlands. Yeah. So I mean, and there are many other issues that in which I think Scandinavians and other Northern European countries are doing quite well. But this combination of economic dynamism and social equity, I think, is quite a difficult balance to strike, and I think those countries have done that. Yeah? But at the same time, there are other countries that are good at other things. South Korea, my native country, has been extremely successful in creating an economy that is based on innovation and creativity. On the other hand, it has the very poor the welfare system, so much so that now the countries got a serious problem with falling social mobility, the lowest fertility rate in the world, the highest gender wage gap in the OECD. So, on those things, it has done terribly. Huh? So I'm sure that you can say similar things about all the countries, including the Northern European countries, because there are obviously the problems in those countries too. But if you ask my preference, I would say Northern Europe. But the other people have different political views and ethical views.
Clearly. What are the economic indicators that you're using to measure Scandinavia as your favorite economic system?
On a number of indicators. Yeah. So the first is the economic growth rate. Yeah. So actually, people have this the notion that if you have high equality, it means that you don't grow fast. Yeah, you may have equal society, but your economy loses dynamism because entrepreneurs don't bother, and But actually, Sweden, Finland, these countries in the last 6-7 decades have grown faster than the United States.
Do you want to know a really interesting statistic that backs up what you just said? People might think that because of the extremely high taxes that this country is very unattractive to entrepreneurs. But per capita, there are more unicorns in Stockholm than there are in Silicon Valley.
Yeah. No, that's very impressive. No, yeah, exactly. I mean, this is no coincidence, because the system, of course, imposes high taxes and so on, but that tax is used to provide social stability. But more importantly, for the point that we are discussing now, I mean, it enables the society to utilize all the talents in society. Yeah? Because in Sweden and other Northern European countries, it is actually very possible for people who have come from very low background to rise to the top, because of the welfare system, the education system, and the training and retraining programs. So actually, the Americans are just think about it. I mean, they are getting all this entrepreneurial talent from
countries. So
some the incredible strengths, but it its internal system has now ossified that it cannot bring people up from the lower strata of society. Another indicator that look at is that the rate of the indicators of income distribution. Of course, that in Sweden and recently inequality has risen, but still the by international standard is very, very low, and that makes a more pleasant society. Go to New York, London, that you see so many homeless people in Britain, which is one of the richest societies that the world has, the humanity has ever created. You have millions of people going hungry. Reports of school kids stealing their mates' lunch, bringing a single slice of moldy bread for lunch and stuff like that. So, I don't want to kind of live in that kind of society, how much wealth it might create overall. So, but there are your unicorn indicators is also very, very important. All these the indicators are pointing out that these countries have got it better than most other countries.
what about the cultural question here? It's also worth mentioning that Sweden is extremely homogenous. They all sort of practice the same religion. They generally all have the same type of family values. There is so little friction when it comes to people's worldview and sort of ambition for life within the Swedish society, which has to be this giant intangible reason why all these other things seem to work, why there is so much trust in the government to be willing to give 60% of your income, which is my fucking tax rate. It's a joke. But I'm here, right? And I decide to do it. So, what about the cultural question? How does that feed into your economic worldview?
Yeah. No, those are cultural aspects are broadly defined. People's worldview, their relationship with each other, their view about the community, the trust in the public authority, and all of these. Of course, these things matter enormously. But I have been writing quite a lot of stuff on this aspect, arguing that these things are important, but they can be changed. They have been changed. So Sweden itself is a very good example. In the 1920s, Sweden actually had the worst industrial relations in the world. Yeah? The country lost the largest number of working days in strikes per worker in the world. Yeah? So it was a very conflictual society. Never mind the homogeneity. Homogeneity can actually make a society more conflictual because people might be far less willing to accept high inequality in a homogeneous society. In the US, you have all kinds of immigrant groups and so on coming from different backgrounds at different times. So it's in that country, people are more willing to accept a high degree of inequality because they think, we are different from them. The ancestors have been here for a few centuries. We just came, in the last 20 years or whatever. But in homogeneous societies, inequality is harder to accept. which is actually the case in Korea too. That you see all these dramas from Netflix coming out of Korea, and the movie Parasite and stuff like that. You see very, very high tension, even though, Korea is actually quite unequal by the standard of Europe, but, it's still one of the more equal societies, but people just cannot accept it because they are so homogeneous. Yeah? So anyway, going back to Sweden, in the 1920s, you had terrible industrial relations, and then the country had big problems with the Great Depression. At some point, unemployment rate was 30%, and the conflict grew and grew. But they finally realized that if they behave like this, they are all going to go down the drain together. So that is when 1938, the workers and the capitalists got together to sign this the Saltsjöbaden the agreement. I don't know whether I got the pronunciation right.
Saltsjöbaden. How about that? Okay, that's a rogue reference.
Yeah. In that agreement, basically the workers and capitalists came to a basic understanding that they need to work together. Yeah. And it's only after that the capitalists became more willing to pay higher taxes to fund the welfare state. The workers became more restraining in terms of their industrial actions, that the country eventually developed this very cooperative, trustworthy culture. Same story Japan. I mean, it's another society known for the peaceful industrial relations and trust in each other. But 1950s and 60s, Japan lost more working days to industrial strikes per worker than did, not to speak of Sweden and Germany, but then did Britain and France. You know? It had very bad industrial relations because they had quite tense situation with a very strong militant communist union, and the capitalists are still not quite willing to make concessions. But once again, from the 60s, they realized we need to solve this. And the companies started creating, I mean, it was a very different arrangement from Sweden, but the companies that started creating what is known as lifetime employment for the core workers. They provided company welfare. The workers started moderating their demand. The communist unions, the popularity fell because of that. In the end, I mean, it's not as good as the Scandinavian system, because it is great in Japan if you belong to the, say, top 50% of the workforce, because you have your job guaranteed, you have very good company welfare, this the kind of part-time workers are working in smaller companies that cannot offer these things. They are not doing very well, yeah? But still, I mean, they were able to solve their problem. So once again, the important point about culture is that, yes, it matters, but it can be reconstructed. It has been reconstructed, partly through these political efforts, but also through the very development of the economy, because when our material conditions change, people's attitude change. So one thing that a lot of the developing countries are finding it difficult is to basically make their workers accept kind of industrial discipline, yeah? Keeping time and being there when you are needed, and working in cooperation with other workers, because in agrarian societies, timekeeping is not that important. Yeah, I mean, you are essentially working, except for a few major tasks, that you are essentially working alone. Yeah, you are not tied to the production line and so on. So people in agrarian societies have a very different attitude towards these things, and when they first start working in factories, I mean, they appear lazy and uncooperative and exceptionally individualistic and so on. And indeed, this was, as I cite in a couple of my works, that this was the conclusion that this Australian engineer who visited Japan in 1915 drew. He was invited by the Japanese government to advise on how to improve the productivity in Japanese factories. And he basically said, that these guys are just too relaxed, they don't keep time, they are lazy, And when I asked, and when I asked the Japanese managers that what they're going to do about it, that they said, oh, we cannot change national character. Fast forward that 50 years later, I mean, this was 1950, 50 years later, the Japanese came to be known as worker ants.
Exactly, yeah.
When the society industrializes, more and more people learn this capitalist labor discipline and timekeeping, and their attitude change. Yeah? So while the culture is extremely important, I think the problem with the people who are advocating the importance of culture is that they usually think of it as fixed, national character, coming from, if not 2,000 years ago, at least for the last few centuries. I think that needs to.
The question of culture is extremely fascinating to me, and I'm sure you'll get a chance to speak about it again when we speak about your time at the World Bank. But there are other questions we need to address. So I would ask you to please, not as quickly as possible, but in a more terse manner, speak to me about the chapter on how we misunderstand inflation, because this seems like a very relevant question at the moment.
Yes, I think the world has been obsessed with inflation for the last at least 5 decades because we had this very bad experience with inflation in the 70s, following on from the oil shock. And a lot of effort had gone into controlling inflation since the 1980s. And yeah, indeed, we have not everywhere, but in most countries have succeeded in bringing down the inflation since then, although now it's spiking up again because of the war in Ukraine, disruption to the global supply chain due to COVID pandemic and so on. But the unfortunate thing is that this view of macroeconomic stability is too narrow, because just think about it. The last few decades, we may have had relatively low inflation measured by consumer price index. That is basically the prices that we encounter when we go to supermarkets. The world has seen so many macroeconomic instabilities because we had so many big financial crashes. So in the age we had the Chilean banking crisis, the third world debt crisis, the savings and loan debacle in the U.S., and the Mexican peso crisis, Asian crisis, Brazilian, Russian, until we got to experience 2008 global financial crisis. You are not actually measuring macroeconomic stability in the right way, because you are looking only at a small part of it. So that the consumer price index, it's important, but how about asset prices? I mean, in many countries, house prices in relative terms have gone up so much, but it's not included in the headline inflation rate. We have had all these macroeconomic instabilities coming from financial crashes and so on, but it's not reflected. It's not reflected in the headline inflation rate. So the problem is not so much that macroeconomic stability is unimportant, but that we are measuring it in the wrong way. We are just looking at a tiny bit of this much bigger issue called macroeconomic stability, and we get too obsessed with it, and then we ignore other more important things.
So what's the takeaway then if you're an individual looking at an inflation rate of 6, 7, 8, 9%, and you're starting to really, really feel it every time you fill up your car or you go grocery shopping? What is the lesson within that chapter that you would want to impute onto the people?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, there isn't a huge amount that individuals can do that when we face inflation, because that is a systemic problem. I mean, sometimes it's oversupply of money, sometimes it's overspending by the government. This time around, it's basically the supply side issues. So as an individual, we cannot solve this problem. But yeah, as an individual, one thing that we have to remember is that even while your grocery bill and the gas bill might be going up, if you have debt, in general, that you are benefiting from inflation.
It's going down.
It's not all bad news.
Yeah, that's a nice bow on it, actually.
Yeah.
Nice. A very provocative statement you make within the book is that the washing machine changed the world more than the internet. Now, I don't know when this book was written, but I think it was more than 10 years ago. I wonder whether you can still make this argument.
Yeah, I will still hold on to it. There will be a point when I say, it hasn't. But until now, I think, we tend to take existing things for granted too much. So just go back, you are talking about a completely different world. You have societies where 10, 15, even higher percentage of people are in so-called domestic service. That they are cleaning and cooking and changing bed sheets or whatever. We have a world where the very few women, even in the most affluent societies, actually can go out and work. We have a world where the most families had like 5, 6, yeah, if not more children. Yeah? Now we live in the world where, you know, most of the domestic services are done by machines. Yeah. I mean, in the affluent societies, the large proportion, if not necessarily the majority of women are in paid employment, and most families have but 1, 2, maximum 3 kids. Yeah? So this these have changed the social dynamic completely. Now, I'm not saying that all of this was due to washing machine and other household machines. I mean, there were also other important changes about the nature of work. There have been a lot of automation, so now muscle power is less important than, say, a century ago. So that women have become more competitive in lots of jobs. Yeah, I mean, a lot of these the old traditional sexist ideas have broken down, and now a lot of women are going to universities, getting highly qualified, and so on. So I'm not saying this entirely because of these household machines, but yet, those have played a very important role. So, you know, when we are comparing what the internet has done so far, I don't think that we are talking about the same magnitude of change yet. Maybe in 10 years' time, maybe 20 years' time, I'll say, yeah, now it has completely changed the society that now I would admit that the washing machine isn't as important as the internet. But so far, it's beginning to influence now the factories and driving and lots of things. So we are getting there. But so far, it has mostly been on the kind of the social entertainment side of things. Yeah? I mean, I love the internet because
But it's much more than just social entertainment. I mean, how many people can do their job without a computer?
No, that's true, but it hasn't yet reached a stage where a whole class of workers are just eliminated.
Obsolete. Yeah.
Yeah, it's coming. It's coming
Right.
because soon we'll have the kind of
Yeah.
artificial intelligence doing the works of lawyers and accountants and maybe even the university professors. It is definitely coming, but not yet.
I know it's probably an impossible task, but have you read anything about the economic impact of, say, the washing machine, or the economic impact of, say, the internet? Has anyone done some grand study to try and figure out?
I think it will be a fascinating the balance sheet to draw up,
Yeah.
because
Okay.
no, but actually it is at one level a fundamentally unfair comparison because the internet has been around for only, say, 3 decades. The washing machine and other things, the other household machines have been around for a century. So at one level, it's a fundamentally unfair comparison. And yeah, probably if you give both 100 years, I mean, definitely the internet will have done more. But no, I was with that chapter just trying to kind of remind people that actually we tend to take so many things for granted, and we think always that the changes that are happening to us are the biggest and the most important and so on. But take a step back and you can get a better sense of proportion.
Cool. I would love to hear you speak about South Korea. There is a figure called Chung Ju-yong, who I listened to a podcast about his biography, and he had truly maybe one of the most exceptional lives of anyone who ever lived. And you discuss him specifically in your new book, which is The Economics of Food, in the noodle chapter. So I'd love to hear you explain the culture of South Korea via the life of Mr. Chung Ju-yong.
Yeah, Chung Ju-yong is probably one of the greatest entrepreneurs that the humanity has produced ever. I mean, he started out as a kind of small-time rice merchant. I mean, he was kind of selling rice in the kind of the provincial areas, and then he got into construction business and built one of the biggest construction companies in the country at the time. I'm talking about the 1950s and this, but he was a very, very ambitious man, and he eventually wanted to compete in the best of the industries. He got into automobile industry as his first attempt to diversify away from construction. And initially, he ran this small assembly plant in collaboration with Ford, producing like 3,000 cars per year, that kind of thing. And most of the parts were basically imported from America and other parts where Ford was in operation. But in 1973, he made this big decision to develop his original model. Now, this was not entirely him, because the South Korean government was also as ambitious as him and wanted to develop an indigenous automobile industry. And the South Korean government said, unless you come up with your own model, we are going to cancel your license. No more of this importing foreign models, assembling them and selling them. So the two forces that really came together, and the automobile corporation was came up with this local model called Pony in 1975, and went into production in 1976. But from the beginning, it was a very ambitious company, because they asked, as I talk about in my new book, Edible Economics, in the chapter called Noodle, they asked the world famous car designer called Giugiaro, this Italian car designer who has designed over 100 cars for almost all the car companies in the world, Volkswagen Golf and everything that you have heard of. So there was already this big ambition that we are going to be a world-class company. But in the beginning, it was the kind of pitiful side. In 1976, the first full year of production, Hyundai produced 10,000 cars. And in the same year, Ford produced 1.9 million cars. General Motors produced 4.8 million cars. So just imagine, if I took a time machine, went back to 1976 and told people, look, this 2-bit the automobile company in the kind of lower middle income country called South Korea, which produces 10,000 cars a year, but give it just over 30 years, it will be bigger than Ford. In less than 40 years, it will be producing more cars than General Motors. People that put me in mental hospital. But this is what happened. From 2009, Hyundai produced more cars than Ford. From 2015, it produced more cars than General Motors. So this was the ambition of the unimaginable scale. But the important thing is that this company and many other South Korean companies succeeded because it kept investing, kept developing new technologies, kept training the workers, and kept developing the new models, and basically kept upgrading its the technologies and product quality constantly. So there's an important lesson there. These days, especially in the Anglo countries, the US, the UK, and others, there's this idea that the financial alchemy, almost, or at least that financial engineering is the way to make money. And indeed, they are making lots of money. But those the efforts are in the end kind of weakening the underlying economy, because there's nothing going back into those enterprises. Yeah? I think there's the important set of lessons there. So first of all, Mr. Chang, Ju-yong and other Koreans, they were very ambitious. You go to some developing countries, especially in Latin America, they are very good at the things that they are already good at. Yeah, Colombia produces the best coffee in the world. Chile has come from nowhere to become the second biggest salmon exporter in the world, and so on. But
I didn't know they were that.
Yeah.
I thought it was like America, Norway, Scotland, or something like that. Okay.
No, not anymore. So Norway is still number one, but Chile is now number two. So Chile's are very good at what they're already doing, but they are not ambitious. I mean, there's no ambition that we will one day, beat up the biggest boys, And that I think is an important lesson about Korean economic development, and is that kind of, as you put it, the cultural attitude towards these things. So that's the first lesson. The second lesson is that these people understood Mr. Chung and the Koreans who worked with him, who competed with him, and everyone, they knew that you cannot get something out of nothing. You have to put in the effort, you have to invest, you have to develop technologies, you have to constantly upgrade. So that's another important lesson to learn from that experience. I mean, it is that, I mean, as I already mentioned, I mean, we have some very big problems, but I think that this aspect of industrialization, technological upgrading, instant innovation, but very proud of what my country has achieved.
And does it still have a rosy future? Do those same values still live in the culture? You mentioned earlier the rising prominence of South Korea in pop culture, with Squid Games and with Parasite, and all of a sudden it's a place that people like really, really, really want to go to. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think the country has this incredible strength still in terms of its willingness to innovate and really shoot for the highest stars. But I think, unfortunately, we've been losing this mobilize all of society's talents, because in the early 90s, it was literally possible to be born in the poorest family in the country and become the republic's president, Supreme Court judge, the top scientist, because we at the time had that very flat social structure. The old feudal hierarchy was destroyed first through Japanese colonialism, and then the Pacific War, and the Second World, the Korean War, and the land reform, and so on. So that, and then we had quite a meritocratic education system, so we were able to utilize all the talents that in the society to create some incredible things. Mr. Ju-yong being a very good example, But now the society is ossifying. That's the kind of thing you are seeing in Parasite, Squid Game. I mean, lots of the recent Korean dramas. Now the younger generation, they feel very frustrated because unless they come from the top, say, 10% of families, they have so many obstacles to realizing their dreams and expanding their talents. So I think we need to get that right through a better welfare system, for the education system, and so on. But yeah, I mean that somewhat ludicrous ambition that enabled people like Mr. Chung and the big Korean entrepreneurs and the policymakers of the earlier years is still there. So I live in hope.
There is a really interesting question on economic development that I wanted to ask you. You've been a consultant to the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the European Investment Bank, and as well as Oxfam. So from working with all of these different organizations, what is something interesting that you've learned about economic development?
Yeah, I think one important thing to bear in mind when we talk about these big organizations is that they have this big kind of headlines, decided by the top people. But these are very large and complex organizations. So actually what they are depends on which part you look at and which part you work with. So the World Bank, as a kind of corporate policy, might state that we are going to liberalize trade all over the world. We are going to privatize everything. But actually, when you work with the people who work there, who are in charge of a particular country or particular sector, particular aspects of policy, whether it's social policy or trade policy, actually you meet very diverse people. And in that sense, my sample is biased because people who don't like what I say wouldn't have asked me to work with them. So people within those organizations that who interested in listening to something different, listening to the unusual point of view that I have worked with, and I had very good experiences with those people. But the problem with these big international organizations is that they are, in the end, a very politicized organization. Whatever good policy that people lower down come up with, yeah, if it doesn't match the top corporate kind of vision, that they get ignored. You know, that people often ask me, "Oh, you have been criticizing the World Bank for decades, and how can you work with them?" I say it's very easy, because I criticize their headline policies, but actually what I do with this economist or that department in the World Bank, I'm very happy with, because these are, in the end, very pragmatic people. They want to help this country, help the sector, help this group of people. And then we try to find a way to do that in the best possible way. So, yes, I mean, the overall experience with these people have been good. But, you know, I mean, the problem is that this is a very biased sample.
Can you give an example of when the recommendation you made went against the sort of headline politics? I mean, isn't the whole idea of a World Bank to be politically agnostic? Can you give us an example?
Yeah, no, I mean, what's there? I mean, for example, once I work with a group of World Bank economists to kind of develop more kind of nuanced understanding of deregulation. You know, this was in the World Bank headline policy was, you know, you deregulate everything you can think of, yeah. But there was this group of the World Bank economists who were not happy with that kind of bulldozer approach, and they contacted me asking me to write research the paper to provide a more kind of if you like, the multi-dimensional and nuanced view of regulation. So yeah, I wrote a research paper saying that, you know, yes, I mean, sometimes deregulation is good, sometimes it's even necessary, but you need to make this decision sector by sector, country by country, because there's no, you know, economic theory that says the more deregulated your economy is, the better it is. Yeah? So I was trying to explain what kind of things that you might consider when making a decision as to whether to deregulate the particular sector, particular industry. Yeah, so they were very happy with the report, but I don't know what kind of impact it had internally. I mean, you know,
Yeah.
they must have used it to make their case, but you know, who knows? I mean, it's a huge organization. You know, these were just a small group of people. Yeah.
Speaking of these international banks that are supposed to be apolitical, what's your take on foreign aid? Because, you know, there is, from what I see, you know, like an obvious divide between people saying it's absolutely necessary versus it's actually a detriment to the country. You know, a wild shocking statistic that Michael Yaus on episode 12 of this podcast said was that Africa imports more calories than they produce themselves. And Africa is the most fertile land for agriculture in the world, even more so than the United States. So that's just a crazy statistic to fathom. What is your position, given your very sort of eclectic and pluralistic economic worldview? I'd be very interested to know what you think about foreign aid.
Well, yeah, once again, my view is that it can be very good, can be a really bad thing. Yeah? I mean, let's begin from the beginning. I mean, at one level, you know, if there's more money, who can argue with it? Yeah? I mean, most developing countries need more money. So that's the starting point. But of course, that it can be appropriated by small group of people and used for the wrong things. Yeah? It can be implemented, used in a generally decent way, but you know, you might have designed the scheme and actually they don't work. You know, what comes out of it really depends on how you use the money. Yeah? So there are cases where the foreign aid did some really important good things, you know, for example, that in the 1950s, South Korea was devastated. First the Pacific War, and then the Korean War. Yeah, I mean, the people were starving, and the country was not able to invest more than like 5% of its GDP. It was a terrible situation. So in that situation, foreign aid from the U.S. Mainly, but other the rich countries enabled the country to rebuild the infrastructure that was destroyed through the Korean War, send the kids to school. So yeah, I mean, you have examples like that where foreign aid was crucial in the country's future development. Yeah? On the other hand, you have many examples where foreign aid, first of all, is kind of hugely exaggerated because, first of all, a lot of money is used for companies and consultants from the country that is giving the aid. So actually, they might say, oh, we have a foreign aid budget of, I don't know, 500 million, but actually the actual money that goes to recipient countries might be that only 20% of that or whatever. So that's that one problem. And secondly, there are countries where this aid is appropriated by the corrupt political elite, and then there are all kinds of schemes that are introduced that haven't been really thought through, so that do not benefit the country to the extent that you'd expect from seeing the figure. But yeah, I mean, on the whole, I think I would say foreign aid is a good thing for countries at very low levels of development, yeah, where South Korea was 1950s and so on, provided that the political corruption doesn't eat it away. At the middle income level, it becomes more debatable. Then you really need to look at the particular scheme, the particular way in which it's used. So then you are really talking about a case-by-case approach. So yeah, I mean, my answer is very complicated, but that's how I see it, yeah.
Well, fascinating. Also, for those listening along at home, Ha-Joon and I have had really, really poor internet connection on this entire conversation, which is obviously very frustrating, but we must endure. Maybe some of that foreign aid can be sent Sweden's way for better fiber optic cables. What do you think? Would that be a good allocation of resources? Look, the final two questions for you, Ha-Joon. These are questions that I like to ask absolutely every guest. The first is, what is a country you're particularly bullish on?
Is there such a country? Not particularly, I think. Well, I think it depends on what kind of time frame we are talking about. I mean, if you are talking about, say, next 10 years, I would certainly say Vietnam. It's been doing very well. The challenge for Vietnam will be whether they can now upgrade this economy in the same way that South Korea did in the, say, 1970s and 80s. Yeah. I'm not sure whether they have a good plan to do that. Yeah. I mean, they run on the past steam for another 10 years in a good way. In 10 years' time, their wages will be too high for the kind of things they are exporting now, coffee, the electronics assembly. So where do you go for the next step? That I'm not sure about.
Okay, interesting. Well, it's nice to see Vietnam join the list. I think that might be the first time they've had an answer in over 100 interviews. Finally, Ha-Joon, if you could listen to a conversation between any two people of history, dead or alive, no language barrier. So if you were to listen to a podcast between these two people, who would it be?
Gosh, that's an interesting question. One historic person and one current person. So the historic person is Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary of the United States, the guy who invented the infant industry argument, which has been central to my vision of economic development. I mean, from what I can gather from his biographies and so on, I think he was a rather arrogant and obnoxious character. But, he is really the first one that has come up with a systematic approach to economic development. So I think we have to have him.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, maybe if he comes alive and turns out to be excessively obnoxious, then I'm not sure whether he'll not regret my choice. But what can you do? And I think Hamilton's modern conversation partner would choose Sanna Marin, the Finnish prime minister.
Well, Ha-Joon, I can't thank you enough for being so generous with your time. And
Thank you for your patience. I mean, I haven't been able to communicate with you as quickly as I should. But I mean, the last few weeks I have been insane with the release of the new book, and I was.
That's okay. No, it's cool. And edible economics. So I'll make sure that there is a link to that in the description.
Thank you.